March 4, 2024, Ilion, New York. A sub-freezing morning where the wind off the Mohawk River doesn't just bite, it reminds you of what's been lost. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the air along the Erie Canal doesn't taste of coal dust and machine oil. The rhythm of hammers that could be heard a mile away since 1828 has been replaced by an unmistakable, suffocating reality of silence. Rewind 154 years. It's the summer of 1870, 5 o'clock in the morning, and the forges are already glowing white-hot. Inside this sprawling brick complex, 1,800 men are moving in a synchronized dance of fire and steel. They are producing 1,400 rifles every single day, more firepower than the entire British Empire could produce at the time. At the center of every piece of metal is a single name stamped into metal that would arm nations and tame frontiers: Remington. For 207 years, this factory defined what American manufacturing could be. It armed the Union to save the Republic. It equipped half the armies of Europe, and it created the Model 870, the best-selling shotgun in the history of the human race. This wasn't just a workplace. It was a 1,000,000-square-foot mosaic of 42 buildings that served as the heartbeat of a village. And then, on a cold Monday in March, the machines just stopped. The name was pried off the walls, and the oldest continuously operating firearms factory in the United States closed its doors forever. Was this the inevitable price of progress, or was it the longest, slowest suicide in American industrial history? Did you have a Model 870 or a 700 passed down through your family? Maybe you know someone who spent their life on the floor at Ilion, or you have a memory of what that factory meant to your town. Share it in the comments. I'm your host, and this is Industrial Aftermath. Now, let's begin. The story of Remington doesn't begin with a boardroom, a government contract, or a bank loan. It begins at a single anvil. It is the summer of 1816. And the air in the Mohawk Valley is thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Deep inside a small forge, 23-year-old Eliphalet Remington II stands staring at a piece of raw iron, driven by a frustration that would eventually reshape the American frontier. He wanted a high-quality rifle, but in an era of agrarian struggle, he simply couldn't afford to buy one. So, with the grit and obsession that defines every industrial titan we study on this channel, he decided to build it himself. Eliphalet had spent months studying the secret techniques of gunsmiths, teaching himself the geometry of barrel making through a grueling process of trial and error. The work was exhausting, a manual battle against the stubbornness of metal. He selected his iron with obsessive care, knowing that even the smallest impurity would create a weakness that could cause a barrel to explode in a man's face. He heated the metal until it glowed an orange-white that seared the eyes, then hammered it relentlessly around a mandrel to form a basic tube. Each barrel required hundreds of precisely placed blows from a heavy hammer, reshaping and refining the iron until it achieved the perfect dimensions. Finally, at welding heat, he hammered the seam shut, a high-stakes maneuver where the temperature had to be exactly right, or the entire month's work would fail catastrophically. When the rough barrel was complete, he walked it to a gunsmith in Utica to have it rifled and fitted to a wooden stock. That autumn, Eliphalet entered a local shooting match. He finished second. But the men on that field didn't care about the score. They cared about the machine. They felt the balance of his rifle, noted the meticulous workmanship, and marveled at the precision of the bore. Before Eliphalet left that field, he had orders for more barrels than he could possibly count. For the next 12 years, the Remington Forge remained a modest operation, with Eliphalet and his father producing roughly 8,000 barrels a year for gunsmiths across the region. But his reputation was growing with every hammer blow. Gunsmiths in Albany and Utica began specifically demanding his metal, recognizing that in a flooded market of inconsistent junk, Remington's consistent quality commanded a premium. This was the Artisan Origin of a legend, a young man who made something with his hands because he was too poor to buy it, and in doing so, laid the first brick of an empire that would outlast him by 2 centuries. But as the Erie Canal opened nearby in 1825, the world was about to move faster than a hand-cranked forge could handle. It was time to leave the father's shop and build a monument. By 1828, the air at the old family forge in the hills had grown too small for Eliphalet Remington's ambition. He was 35 years old, a master of his craft, and he realized that if he stayed in the shadows of his father's workshop, he would remain a local artisan while the world was becoming an industrial empire. Imagine the Mohawk Valley in the late 1820s. The frontier was moving west, and the primary engine of that movement was the Erie Canal. Completed just 3 years earlier in 1825, the canal was the internet of the 19th century, a liquid highway that allowed goods to reach New York City in a fraction of the time it once took a wagon to struggle through the mud. Eliphalet saw the strategic potential of this waterway and made a move that would define the next 2 centuries of American firearms. He purchased 100 acres along the canal bank at a place then known as Morgan's Landing. This stretch of silt and water would soon be renamed Ilion, but in 1828 it was the site of a radical industrial experiment. Eliphalet wasn't just moving his tools, he was replacing his own muscles with the raw power of nature. The Mohawk Valley was blessed with swift streams that dropped nearly 1,000 feet over short distances, racing to meet the river with a force that could be harnessed. Inside the new factory, the rhythm of hammers changed. The solitary, exhausted strike of a man at an anvil was replaced by the thunder of water-powered trip hammers. Enormous water wheels, turned by the weight of the rushing current, now drove mechanical drilling machines that could bore rifle barrels with a precision and speed no human hand could ever hope to match. This was the transition from a workshop to an industrial cathedral. Where Eliphalet once produced hundreds of barrels a year by hand, the new factory was soon churning out thousands. But as we often see in the stories on this channel, scale can sometimes come at the cost of soul, unless you guard it. Eliphalet understood that in a market starting to be flooded with inconsistent, mass-produced junk, consistency was his only currency. He began stamping a distinctive mark near the breech of every barrel, a simple word in steel Remington. It wasn't just a label, it was a promise that the weapon wouldn't fail when a settler's life depended on it. By the early 1830s, gunsmiths from Albany to the Western Territories weren't just asking for barrels, they were specifically demanding Remington metal. Consistent quality had become a premium. The workshop was dead. The factory was alive. But as the water wheels turned and the smoke began to rise over Ilion, the company was about to face its first true test, the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of a government at war. A contract was coming that would either build the Remington legend or crush it under the weight of its own success. By 1845, the wind in the Mohawk Valley changed. For nearly 30 years, Eliphalet Remington had been the barrel maker to the frontier, but a courier arriving from Washington was about to demand he become the arsenal of the Union. A Cincinnati manufacturer named John Griffiths had defaulted on a contract for 5,000 Model 1841 percussion rifles, the Mississippi Rifle, leaving the U.S. Army desperate as the Mexican-American War loomed. This was the moment Remington transitioned from an artisan workshop to a true industrial cathedral. Manufacturing a complete rifle was a different kind of merciless arithmetic. It required not just a perfect bore, but the fabrication of intricate locks, trigger guards, and stocks with interchangeable precision. Remington didn't hesitate. He expanded the Ilion factory at a feverish pace, recruiting skilled workers from the firearms hubs of Connecticut and Massachusetts, and purchasing state-of-the-art machinery from the Ames Manufacturing Company. He delivered every rifle on time and exceeded every specification. The Ordnance Department, accustomed to private contractors who cut corners and made excuses, had found their miracle worker. But the true test, the era that would forge the Remington legend in blood and steel, arrived in April 1861, when Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. The U.S. Army was a frontier force of only 16,000 men. Suddenly, the Republic needed weapons in quantities that beggared the imagination. the Ilion plant exploded into activity. To keep pace with the rhythm of hammers, Remington installed massive steam generation systems to supplement his water wheels. At the height of the Civil War, the factory floor was a study in organized chaos. 1,800 men and boys worked shifts so long that many simply slept on the floor between rounds. The air they breathed thick with coal dust and the metallic tang of hot iron. During those 4 years, Remington produced approximately 250,000 rifles, carbines, and revolvers. The rivalry with Samuel Colt defined the era. While Colt's revolvers had the fame, Remington's new model Army had the frame. Engineered by Fordyce Beals, the Remington revolver featured a solid steel frame that connected the barrel to the grip, making it a machine that wouldn't quit compared to Colt's open-top design. It was easier to maintain and faster to reload, a survival advantage that made it the choice of veterans who valued reliability over flash. By the end of the conflict, the company had generated nearly $3 million in sales, a staggering fortune for the mid-19th century. But this victory came at the ultimate cost. Eliphalet Remington II, the man who started at a father's anvil, did not live to see the Union saved. Worn down by the relentless demands of wartime production and the weight of his own empire, he died in August 1861, just months after the first shots were fired. He left his 3 sons to manage a monument to industrial ambition that was now the second largest gun factory in the world, an empire built on consistent quality that would soon attempt to conquer the armies of Europe. By 1866, the guns of the Civil War had fallen silent, but in the village of Ilion, the rhythm of hammers was only reaching a crescendo. The Remington brothers had inherited a monument to industrial ambition and a new machine that would conquer the world, a breech-loading rifle using a rolling block mechanism. It was a design of elegant simplicity, a hammer and a breech block that mutually supported each other under the pressure of firing. The more powerful the cartridge, the more tightly the mechanism locked. By 1867, at the Paris Exposition, it was officially crowned the finest rifle in the world. Samuel Remington didn't wait for the world to come to the Mohawk Valley. He sailed to Europe with the samples in hand, a salesman driven by the grit and obsession typical of the era. He arrived at a moment of merciless arithmetic for the Old World, as European nations raced to replace slow muzzle loaders with the rapid fire of metallic cartridges. The response was overwhelming. Denmark contracted for 42,000 rifles, Sweden took 250,000, and Spain eventually ordered a staggering 1.5 million. By the early 1870s, the Ilion factory had become an integrated industrial cathedral, employing 1,850 workers, more than the entire village population, when the forge first moved to the canal bank. Daily output reached 1,400 rifles and 200 revolvers, more firepower than the entire British Empire could produce. From the deserts of Egypt to the plains of the American West, the Remington name was stamped into the metal that tamed frontiers. On the American prairies, the rolling block became the weapon of choice for buffalo hunters, a machine that wouldn't quit and could drop a 2,000-pound animal at hundreds of yards. This was the golden age of Remington, a period where the company seemed to have discovered the secret to perpetual success. But the brothers were not content to remain only gunmakers. In 1870, they began to diversify, a move that would prove to be a dangerous trap. They produced sewing machines and agricultural implements, but their most famous gamble arrived in 1873, the typewriter. Under license from Christopher Latham Scholes, Remington produced the machine that introduced the QWERTY keyboard layout, a legacy that survives on your smartphone today, long after the Ilion forges have gone cold. While they could make almost anything well, they were spreading their resources across too many products, creating a vulnerability that pure focus might have avoided. Failed ventures and a disastrous 1874 fire in their sewing machine subsidiary began to drain their capital. They had built a global empire of steel and fire, but the unforgiving mathematics of debt were beginning to settle over Ilion. By 1886, the oldest gunmaker in America would face its first death of sorts in bankruptcy. proving that even a monument to ambition can be reduced to rubble when the owners choose to spend their money elsewhere. By 1886, the oldest gunmaker in America faced its first death of sorts. For 70 years, the name Remington had been a mark of reliability, but the merciless arithmetic of debt now settled over Ilion. The Remington brothers had fallen into a dangerous diversification trap, spreading their resources across typewriters, sewing machines, and farm tools while the international arms market cooled. Following Samuel Remington's death in 1882, the company's capital evaporated, leading to a catastrophic bankruptcy in 1886. In 1888, the Remington family, the artisans who had built the empire from a father's anvil, were forced out forever, replaced by the financial discipline of Marcellus Hartley. But as we see throughout the history of these industrial cathedrals, war provides a temporary, violent salvation. When the guns of Europe began their thunder in 1914, the demand for steel and fire reached a scale that dwarfed all human imagination. To meet the overflow from Ilion, a Remington subsidiary constructed the Eddystone Rifle Plant in Pennsylvania. Imagine the scale. Eddystone covered 34.5 acres and employed 15,000 workers, making it, for a fleeting moment, the largest rifle factory in the world. Inside those cavernous halls, the air tasted of machine oil and desperation as workers churned out over 100,000 rifles a month. By 1917, nearly two-thirds of the rifles carried by American soldiers in the trenches of France were fabricated by Baldwin and Remington subsidiaries at Eddystone. The most tragic chapter of this era, however, was written in the Cyrillic alphabet. In 1915, the Russian Tsar, his empire crumbling and his army running out of weapons, contracted Remington to produce over 1 million Mosin Nagant rifles. At the Bridgeport and Ilion works, production lines ran 24 hours a day to feed the Tsar's failing war machine. Then came the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917. The new Soviet government, led by men who viewed capitalism as a plague, repudiated the contracts. They claimed the weapons were defective, a convenient lie to avoid paying for an order they had no intention of honoring. Remington was left holding hundreds of thousands of rifles chambered in a Russian cartridge that no other nation on earth used. The financial exposure was a catastrophe. The company had built a monument to the Tsar's ambition, only to find themselves buried under the rubble of a paper promise. Only an emergency intervention by the United States government, which purchased the surplus rifles for training, prevented the company from disappearing into the silence of the Great War's aftermath. It was a stark reminder that even the most powerful industrial giants can be brought to their knees by a repudiated contract and the shifting winds of history. By 1933, the Mohawk Valley had become a graveyard of industrial dreams. The Great Depression had hollowed out the Ilion plant, leaving only 300 workers rattling around in 1 million square feet of brick and shadows. The company that had once armed half the armies of Europe was now facing a death of sorts. But then, a new kind of power arrived. Dupont de Nemours, the chemical titan that built its fortune on gunpowder, saw a noble experiment worth saving. They purchased a 60% stake, and with them came more than just capital. They brought the cold, professional discipline of a global corporation. Dupont began a radical refurbishment. They tore down crumbling structures that had stood since the Civil War and transformed the plant into a modern industrial cathedral. They didn't just wait for the economy to recover, they prepared for the next storm. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, Remington wasn't just ready, it became an essential organ of the arsenal of democracy. The scale of the World War II effort was staggering. Remington didn't just build guns in Ilion, they operated government-owned ammunition plants across the country, like Lake City in Missouri, which became the largest producer of small arms ammunition in human history. Back at the home plant, the rhythm of hammers became a 24-hour-a-day thunder. They simplified the legendary Springfield rifle into the M1903, a .3, replacing expensive machining with stamped steel parts to meet the unforgiving mathematics of global war. By the time the fire stopped in 1945, Remington had sold its 2 millionth rifle. But the true golden age arrived when the soldiers came home. These men had spent 4 years trusting their lives to Remington-built steel, and now they wanted that same consistent quality for their own lives. In 1950, the factory birthed an icon, the Model 870 pump shotgun. It was a masterclass in efficiency, built around twin action bars that prevented binding in the mud. Priced at just $69.95, it democratized quality for the American middle class, eventually rolling 11 million units off the line. 12 years later, engineer Mike Walker perfected the formula with the Model 700 bolt action. Designed with tolerances so tight it achieved sub-minute of angle accuracy straight from the box, it became the benchmark for every hunting rifle on Earth. It was so reliable that the U.S. Marines and the Army adopted it as the foundation for their legendary M40 and M24 sniper systems. For 60 years under Dupont, Remington was stable, profitable, and respected, a monument to an American industrial compact where quality was the only currency that mattered. But as we see so often in the industrial aftermath, the very success that builds a legend also makes it a target for those who value the merciless arithmetic of debt over the legacy of the anvil. For 60 years under Dupont, Remington was a monument to the American industrial compact, a place where stability and quality were the only currencies that mattered. But in 1993, the air in the Mohawk Valley grew thin as the company was sold to Clayton Dubilier and Rice, a New York private equity firm, for $300 million. This was the moment the anvil was replaced by the spreadsheet. Private equity operates on a simple, brutal principle: buy with borrowed money, extract value, and sell before the consequences arrive. The debt used to purchase the legend became the company's own crushing obligation to service. By 2007, the merciless arithmetic of debt loading intensified when Cerberus Capital Management purchased Remington for $370 million. They folded the brand into the Freedom Group, a massive consolidation of historic names like Marlin and Bushmaster. Decisions about steel and rifling were no longer made by men who had spent 30 years on the factory floor. They were made by financial analysts in distant boardrooms who had never held a rifle. Research and development were gutted, and the legendary consistent quality that Eliphalet Remington II had bet his life on began to erode. The consequences were written in blood. In the early 2000s, the X-Mark Pro trigger, designed to cut manufacturing costs, revealed a lethal defect. Rifles began firing without the trigger ever being pulled. Then, on December 14, 2012, the shadow of Sandy Hook fell over Ilion. A Bushmaster rifle, produced by a Remington subsidiary, was used to take the lives of 20 children. The resulting lawsuit was a landmark, eventually ending in a $73 million settlement that exposed a marketing strategy designed to appeal to the anxieties of troubled young men. The reputation that took 2 centuries to build was in tatters, and the company's finances followed. Remington filed for bankruptcy twice in 2 years, leaving its 1 million square foot facility and its workforce as expendable liabilities. In late 2023, the new owners, Rem Arms, made the final business choice to move operations to Georgia, where labor was cheaper and the politics friendlier. The end didn't come with a ceremony. It came with a cold morning in March 2024. Workers who had followed their grandfathers through those doors walked out for the final time, watching as the Remington name was pried off the gray factory walls. 207 years of continuous history ended not because the products failed, but because the owners chose to spend their money elsewhere. As the machines that had run since 1828 fell silent, the village of 8,000 people lost its identity in a single stroke, leaving behind nothing but contaminated soil and an unmistakable reality of silence. This was the final walkout. This was the industrial aftermath. Today, if you walk past the 1 million square foot mosaic of brick and glass along the Erie Canal, you are looking at a monument to an industry that no longer exists. For 207 years, this site was the heartbeat of Ilion, New York, a village of 8,000 people that grew, breathed, and eventually bled in synchronization with the rhythm of hammers inside these walls. The story of Remington is the story of the American Industrial Compact, a deal that said if you worked hard and built products that armed nations and tilled frontiers, you earned a life of dignity. But that compact has been systematically dismantled by the merciless arithmetic of de-industrialization. We are left to wonder, was the silence that settled over Ilion in March 2024 an unstoppable force of globalization? Or was it a series of corporate and political choices made in distant boardrooms by men who valued debt loading over the legacy of the anvil? The tragic irony is that the machines we build become our monuments, but as the Remington name is pried off these gray factory walls, those monuments have become tombs. The Model 870 and the Model 700 are still in the hands of millions. They are machines that wouldn't quit, outlasting the very industrial cathedral that birthed them. But the hands that assembled them, the generations of workers who followed their grandfathers through these gates, have been discarded as expendable liabilities. Ilion now joins the hollowed-out ranks of Flint, Gary, and Youngstown, left with contaminated soil and silence, and the big-time hurt of a vanished identity. We consumed the history, we profited from the legend, and then we erased it when it was no longer convenient for the spreadsheet. As the sun sets over the empty brick mosaic, the rust stains on the concrete remain as stains that don't wash away. They serve as a final haunting reminder that that is how empires end. Not with a bang, but with a legacy reduced to rubble. The forges are cold, the hammers are still. The story of America's oldest gun factory has reached its final chapter, leaving behind only the echo of what was once the arsenal of democracy. I'm your host, and this has been Industrial Aftermath. Thank you for watching. If this story is worth remembering, leave a like and subscribe to help us keep these doors open.